So this legislative session was incredibly successful by many measures. But before we get into bill details, I'll turn it to Andrew to give an overview of the legislative process and talk about some key metrics from the session.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aubrey, for getting us started here. And hello, everyone. Again, my name is Andrew West. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the policy associate at Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. Um, and this year's 2024 legislative session was it was a blast. It was the second regular session of the 74th General Assembly, the first having been the 2023 session from last year. If you go to the next slide there. Some might recall that there was a special session conducted in November to address rising property taxes, but this is a separate thing that began in January. This is just the regular session that meets annually. And before we get into it too much, I'll provide a bit of an overview of what this legislative process looks like and how a bill becomes a law. So some of you might remember from civics class when you were younger, but a bill at the State House begins with its introduction in its first chamber. So whether it's a bill that begins in the House, which is denoted by HB, you'll see on the bill number, it starts with an HB, that means the bill was introduced in the House, or SB means it was introduced in the Senate. And on either side, in either chamber, the bill will first be introduced, where it's given a proper name and bill number, and then is assigned to its first committee. Now, committee hearings are groups of smaller legislators, usually between 5 and 12, that take more time to really get in depth, discuss the bills, hear public testimony. And that's where a lot of the discussion around the bill actually happens, and that is in that first committee hearing. And a committee hearing can be housing and local government is one that we're in often. There's health and human services, there's the judiciary, there are all sorts of committees that meet on specific issues where bills are assigned. If a bill passes out of that first committee and has an associated cost with it, it will head to appropriations. And appropriations is the group where they decide how all of the bills with a cost implication will be decided. If the bill then passes out of appropriations, it will move to the whole chamber. So if it's the House, it moves to the House floor, and then same thing on the Senate floor, where it's discussed for a second and then third reading. The second reading is a more in-depth discussion on the floor where they'll usually introduce amendments, have more discussion on the bill. And the third reading is more formal. It's a formal vote, whereas in the second reading, it's a vote by just the ayes or the nays and sort of whoever's louder there. Next slide. And if the bill passes out of that first chamber, it goes through a bit of a different process in the future. So it will go through a mirror process in the second chamber. And the second chamber can decide to pass the bill with or without amendments. So if they decide that they like it and they want to pass the bill as is, it then goes to the governor where it can be signed into law, it can be vetoed, or it can become law without signing. The process gets a bit more complicated if there are amendments. They can, because the bill then has to go back to the chamber of origin. In that chamber, they can choose to accept the amendments, and that will be passed and sent to the governor's office, or they can reject the amendments, and then both chambers will come together and sort of work out their differences on the bill, and they can either agree and pass the bill, or the bill will die. I'll mention as well that if the bill doesn't pass any one of these steps, so if it doesn't pass the committee hearing, if it doesn't pass out of its second reading on the floor, the bill is considered dead and will then be lost. So when we hear us talk about bills that are dead or bills that have been killed, that means it has just died at some point throughout the process. So this year, it was the second regular session of the 74th General Assembly. And we met for 120 days beginning in January and adjourned in May. Next slide, please. Yep, so we began on January 10th and adjourned May 8th this year. It's constitutionally mandated that we meet for 120 days, and then adjourn sine die, which is a Latin term that means no day. So there's not a day that they will return until the next year. I'll give a bit of an overview of the composition of both chambers. So there are 100 legislators total, 65 in the House and 35 in the Senate. Um, there's a supermajority that the Democrats won in the House in 2022's election, and a near supermajority in the Senate. Senate Dems picked up a few seats from the previous year, and House Democrats did as well. There was a bit of shuffling of positions of leadership roles between 2023 and 2024, but the composition largely remained the same because if a Democrat left their office, they were replaced by a Democrat. So a bit of a shuffling, but overall, it's very similar to those who are following, for those who are following the 2023 session. In total, there were 705 bills introduced. Of those, the majority did pass. So 525, or about 75% of the bills that were introduced, passed, and only 180 failed. So every bill that is introduced is required to have a first committee hearing. So all bills are required by law to have a chance, and once they're introduced, they have to be heard. But that doesn't mean that all of them necessarily pass. And we saw a lot of bills that did not pass this year. And when you think about how busy it is, consider 700 bills move through the whole process in just the span of a few months. As we go throughout this presentation, you'll hear us talk about bill positions, that CCH was supportive on a bill, that we were in an amend position. So I just want to give a quick overview on what we mean when we talk about this. A support position is pretty clear. This means that we were supportive of the bill and wanted to see it pass. A lot of the bills that we take a position on, we tend to be in a support position. Although some of them, we have a bit of a more nuanced position, which looks like an amend. Sometimes an amendment might be that we're supportive of the bill concept, but we want to see some small changes to language just to make sure that it serves the purpose that we want it to serve. An amend can also be that we aren't supportive of a bill, but we could get there if there are some amendment changes. So amend can mean a lot of different things, but kind of reflects situations where it's a bit trickier. And a lot of the work we do is actually working on amendments to the bill. So the support and oppose sometimes can be a bit more clear cut, and an amend is actually where a lot of the work happens. An oppose is a bill that we outright do not want to see pass. Sometimes we'll testify in opposition of a bill, or sometimes we'll just register that we are opposed to the bill. And when we talk about register, you can see all of the positions that organizations and individual lobbyists take on the Secretary of State website, where positions are logged. So you can see who's in favor of a bill, who's against it, who's amending. And monitor means that we're just keeping an eye on it for now. A lot of the time, monitor is what we use to denote that we want to stay involved with the bill. We want to keep tabs on it, but we haven't decided on a position yet. Sometimes we'll end in a monitor if the bill is not something that we decide that we want to support or oppose, and sometimes we'll move into a position later. All right, I'll give a bit of an overview on the 2024 budget environment. This legislative session was really defined by pretty significant fiscal opportunities as well as constraints. Opportunities in the fact that there were a lot of opportunities to use the state's taxpayer Bill of Rights surplus, the Tabor surplus, to fund a wide range of tax credits. There were a lot of tax credits that went through the legislature this year. Not all of them passed, but a couple big ones were House Bill 24-1311, the Family Affordability Tax Credit, that we were in strong support of. And that totals about $700 million in large Tabor surplus years. And that bill ultimately passed. That's one we'll get to a bit later. There was also Senate Bill 24-228, which was part of a deal made with the governor's office on that one that I previously mentioned, the Family Affordability Tax Credit, that cuts the state income tax rate only when the Tabor surplus exceeds $300 million. So there were a lot of bills going through related to tax credits, and there were a lot of opportunities in that regard, but it was also a very tight budget year. The Legislative Council staff and Office of State Planning and Budget, that's LCS and OSPB, provide regular economic forecasts on the budget. And Both of them predicted a pretty significant budget shortfall earlier on in the legislative session, and found that for the fiscal year 2024-25, the budget was out of balance and that we were in the hole for hundreds of millions. There were different estimates, but around $200 million that we were in the hole for. So we already knew that we were in a really tight budget year, and that bills with the high fiscal note, really high associated cost, would have a tough time passing. But once we heard that, that really put additional pressure to lower costs, to try to make deals to reduce the cost of bills, to find solutions that don't really require fiscal notes. So that was a dynamic throughout the legislative session. And while that's always the case, this was especially the case this year. In total, overall, the long bill, which is the state budget bill, ultimately passed with a $40.6 billion spending plan, which included a lot of general fund increases in general fund appropriations for most state departments. Overall, there was a $1.068 billion overall increase, which is a 7% increase year over year. And we were really excited to see $49 million set aside for affordable housing. A lot of those priorities were included in the land use package, which we'll talk about a bit later. And one of the things that we always do and that we're really excited about during the legislative process is our CCH Lobby Day. This year, our Lobby Day was on March 5th, and it's an opportunity for staff, community members, volunteers to all come together and really see what the legislative process looks like and see this work that we're doing at the Capitol day in and day out. We had some great speakers. We had Representative Kyle Brown and Representative Mandy Lindsay come speak about some of the bills that they're leading. And we also heard from our contract lobbyist, Danny McCarthy, who's in the middle there in the suit. And we advocated for 3 of our priority bills this year. I won't go into too much detail, but we talked about House Bill 1322, House Bill 1099, and Senate Bill 211. These were 3 of CCH's really big priorities this year, and we had a lot of our community members all come together, learn about the process, and then at the end get a chance to talk to their elected officials and ask them for their support on these bills. So you see a couple photos of people having really good conversations and really pushing their legislators to support these measures. And a bit of an overview on our advocacy and sort of the results of what we did. In total, of the 705 bills, we tracked about a quarter of them. We tracked 179 of the 705 bills. And again, that might be bills that we were really involved with or some that we just monitored and kept an eye on throughout the session. There were 58 bills that we actively engaged on. That might mean that we testified, that we provided amendments, that we were co-leading the bill, or whatever. But out of those 58, 88% passed. Not necessarily passed, but reached a desired outcome. So if that's a bill that we were supportive, that means that the bill passed. If it was an opposed, that means the bill died. Or bills that had amendments that we were looking to get through, we saw that outcome. We also sent out action alerts to members of our CCH network. There were about 27,000 individuals in that network who received action alerts, and they sent about 742 messages to legislators asking for their support on bills, asking for opposition on other bills. And it's really important that we have that community member advocacy and folks in our advocacy network tapped into the legislative process to weigh in on these issues. In addition, we also provided testimony on 25 bills and 28 times. So the reason that's larger is that we might have testified in both chambers on some bills. All right, and now we'll move into an overview of our priorities and specific bills that we covered. And these are broken up into 4 buckets. The buckets don't change too much year to year. Each year we focus on housing, homelessness, health, and economic stability. Because we know that homelessness is such an intersectional issue, we're involved with a lot of different bills that touch on a lot of different areas. So you'll hear about some bills that address housing. You'll hear some bills that work on family stability, like the tax credits I mentioned, and then bills that specifically target health, the social determinants of health as well. So we really get to be involved with a lot of different things and stay pretty busy during the legislative session. So I'll pass it to Aubrey to get a bit more in depth on some of these housing bills.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. So, as in many years, housing is a cornerstone issue under the Gold Dome, and one of the coalition's top priorities this year was House Bill 1322. What this bill does is it directs the Colorado Department of Healthcare Policy and Finance, or HCPF, you'll hear me refer to it as HCPF from here on out, to conduct a feasibility study and pursue an 1115 waiver so that Medicaid can fund housing and nutrition services to folks in one. We know that providing both housing and supportive services is the way to get people on a path to stability. So we want to make sure that we have the funding to do that on a broader level. Right now, the Department of Local Affairs and HCPF are in on a joint venture called the Statewide Supportive Housing Expansion Pilot Project, or SWISHY. And this pilot project engages housing providers and homeless services support folks to deliver supportive services to 700 Medicaid participants through housing. And this has proved to be very successful, but unfortunately, the pilot concludes in September of this year. So with this bill, we wanted to build on those successes and bring it more statewide. So this bill fortunately passed, and even though the state is directed to submit the findings of the study by November to the Joint Budget Committee, this has been identified as a top priority for the governor. And it's also been identified as a priority at the federal level under the Biden administration. So Colorado is actually expected to submit a waiver on an accelerated timeline this summer and hopefully join at least 17 other states who have similar policies. And we were really proud to have led this effort arm in arm with our friends at Healthier Colorado and Project Angel Heart. The next bill CCH was a leader on was House Bill 1175. We worked with Enterprise Community Partners on this bill. And you all might have a little bell going off in your head if you joined us for last year's legislative wrap-up, because we tried to pass a similar version of this in 2023 under House Bill 1190. This year's effort was a little bit scaled back based on feedback from the governor who vetoed last year's bill. And what this year's bill sought to do was create a local government right of first refusal or offer to purchase qualifying multifamily properties with the goal of providing long-term affordable housing or mixed income development. Right now, we're in an environment where thousands of low-cost, publicly funded multifamily properties are losing their affordability. So those standards that they agreed to when they built those developments decades ago, those are expiring. And that means that we're going to see investors purchasing those properties and turning them into market rate properties and pushing out low-income tenants. So we would love to be able to, as nonprofit housing providers and as local governments, use those properties and maintain affordability. So like I mentioned, this effort was pretty scaled back. It was amended heavily during the legislative process, including a narrowing of the types of eligible properties that this is applicable to, an accelerated timeline for local governments to make an offer and close on a property, and a 5-year sunset review on the policy. One key provision that we were able to protect through our advocacy efforts was a notification process around the expiration of affordability requirements. We were happy to see this bill pass, and as of now, we're expecting the governor to either sign it or just allow it to become law without his signature. The coalition also supported the Colorado Housing Finance Authority, or CHAFA's, efforts on House Bill 1434. What this bill does is it increases the state affordable housing tax credit. And this is kind of the state's version of the low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC, at the federal level. And it's the state's most effective affordable housing tool. It's supported the development of over 10,000 affordable rental units since its inception. And there is a huge amount of competition for these credits. Currently, CHAFA is able to authorize $10 million of credits per year through 2031. But because there's so much demand, we need to increase that amount. And that's exactly what this bill does. Over the next few years, it doubles that credit amount to $20 million, and then it tapers off over the next several years until 2031. And at that time, I'm sure we'll come back and ask for more funding for this effective program. And we were again happy to see that one pass. So Andrew mentioned that land use was a really big theme this year. This took up a lot of our advocacy efforts. Last year, there was a really big bill, Senate Bill 213, that was hotly debated until the last moments of the legislative session, and ultimately it failed, unfortunately. So this year, stakeholders from the affordable housing space, environmental space, and health advocates, as well as local government representatives, got together and pursued the core goals from that previous bill in separate chunks. But together, we expect that they'll make a fundamental change to how growth and development happen across our state. And CCH was deeply involved in writing and amending and lobbying on many of these bills. Specifically, our goal was to ensure that they all have strong affordability standards and anti-displacement measures. We'll first talk about Senate Bill 174, which requires the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, or DOLA, to develop methodologies for conducting statewide, regional, and local housing needs assessments. So this will help us understand who is experiencing housing need, where they're experiencing need, and what that need really looks like. And that will kind of work together with all of these other housing bills that we're discussing to make sure that all of these solutions are tailored to the right folks in the right places. So like I mentioned, affordability and anti-displacement are central to our advocacy efforts on this bill. We worked closely with enterprise community partners again. You'll notice we work with those folks a lot, and the Community Economic Defense Project on several rounds of deep amendments, ones that sought to ensure some consistency around definitions of terms like displacement and affordability, ensuring accountability for completing needs assessments, publishing them, and then acting on them, clarifying deadlines, ensuring displacement mitigation strategies are responsive to displacement risk, and prioritizing development and creation and preservation of regulated affordable housing, or capital A affordable housing, as we like to call it. And ultimately, we did move from an amend position to a support position, and this bill did pass. Similarly, we engaged on negotiations on House Bill 1313 around transit-oriented development. This bill defines transit-oriented communities and then requires them to meet some housing goals. CCH is generally supportive of the concept of increased housing density around transit hubs in particular, but we know that increased supply and increased density alone will not solve Colorado's housing crisis. So for many low and fixed income households, being by transit and relying on transit, it's not just a nice to have, it's a must have. And so we engaged in some conversations with the governor's office and bill sponsors around how to ensure that there was equity measures baked into the bill, including guaranteeing that transit-oriented development doesn't result in displacement of current communities, and ensuring that people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness are really considered explicitly through this language. And this bill also passed, and we also got into a support position ultimately with those amendments. Next, I'll talk about House Bill 1152 just briefly. This wasn't necessarily a coalition priority, but we did push for amendments to ensure affordability. And what this bill does is helps Colorado's growing housing shortage and affordability crisis by allowing most Coloradans to build an accessory dwelling unit on their property. You may have heard these referred to as granny flats. It creates a state program to help assist local governments with implementing ADU-friendly policies, and also supports low and moderate income Coloradans interested in building them. So for us, it was really important to make sure that these state resources were only going to the folks who need them the most, and that these ADUs that are developed aren't necessarily just used for short-term rentals that can make someone a bunch of money, but are actually used for long-term rental housing for people who are at low and moderate income levels. And again, this bill did pass. And similarly, we engaged on House Bill 1304, which prohibits a county or municipality from enforcing minimum parking requirements for residential developments. This can be a really big barrier to development because we just don't have enough surface space for parking. And the coalition successfully advocated for language that wouldn't impact current development deals, where reduced parking requirements were used as an incentive for affordable units to be included in that development. Next, I'll move into some renters protections and resources. This has also been a really big bucket for us over the last several years. And there were many bills this year related to renters protections. And as a large nonprofit landlord and advocate for tenants, CCH is always looking for ways to pass meaningful and balanced landlord-tenant policies. We led on one this year, along with our friends at the Colorado Poverty Law Project, and that bill was House Bill 1099. This bill eliminates the $80 eviction answer filing fee for tenants facing eviction. The answer is a document that tenants have to file if they're facing eviction in order to give their side of the story and push back against that eviction action. If they don't file that, then they, most cases, lose their home. And in a lot of cases also, when people are faced with this initial financial barrier, they actually self-evict and just leave their home, sometimes ending up in a homeless situation because they are just so intimidated by that $80 fee when they were already probably behind on rent to begin with. This change is effective on November 1st, and we expect that this will benefit every renter facing eviction, roughly 50,000 Coloradans per year. It will make the process less intimidating, less stigmatizing, less expensive, and less likely to result in homelessness. The coalition also played a supportive role on two other bills. First is Senate Bill 64. And this bill was led by, again, our friends at Enterprise and also the advocates at Colorado Children's Campaign. And it requires the state to collect, compile, and publish aggregate residential eviction data on a monthly basis. This will really help us get a better sense of what the eviction crisis looks like and how we can better address it in the future. These data points include things like the reason for filing, the property's zip code, the case outcome, the amount of unpaid rent in question, and whether people had representation by legal counsel. This was a multi-year effort, so we were really excited to see this pass. Next, I'll talk about Senate Bill 94. This was led by the Colorado Poverty Law Project, the Denver Foundation, Community Economic Defense Project, and others. And it really puts some teeth into Colorado's warranty of habitability law. We have laws on the books that already kind of direct what landlords and tenants are responsible for, but this gets really specific in terms of what those responsibilities are in the case where habitability issues arise. Most importantly, the bill creates a presumptive time frame for repairs or remediation to be completed. The keyword is completed because currently there are standards for when repairs need to be initiated, but there's nothing in law mandating that those repairs need to be completed. So the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless testified in support of the proposal. Specifically, we highlighted nonprofit housers' responsibility to model best practices for responding to issues with tenants' living conditions. And we were thrilled that this bill became law upon the signature from the governor on May 3rd. So if you or someone you know is facing an issue with habitability of their home, this is something you should really know about, and feel free to reach out for more information. There are a few other renters protections that I will mention, two of which passed and one did not. The one in bold is the one that did not pass, and you'll notice that going forward, that bolded bills failed. So House Bill 1007 was one that we offered a little bit of input on. This prohibits local governments from enacting or enforcing residential occupancy limits based on familial relationship. This helps address the loneliness crisis and the affordable housing crisis. And CCH was supportive of the idea, but we just wanted to make sure there was language regarding compliance with occupancy limits set by local, state, and federal housing programs. We also provided some pretty similar feedback on House Bill 1057, which prohibits landlords from using algorithmic devices to set rent prices. This would have, if it had passed, prevented the automatic ratcheting up of rent prices and helped stymie Colorado's affordable housing crisis. We worked to ensure that the language wouldn't preclude affordable housing providers like us from using tools to establish rent or income limits under those local, state, and federal housing program guidelines. And we're hoping that this will come back in future years, and we were sad to see it die. I think in this case, this died largely because of political reasons rather than policy reasons. It was also important for the coalition to engage in the stakeholder process on 1098. You might have heard of this referred to as for-cause eviction or just cause eviction. This is one we saw last year that didn't pass. And this bill is a powerful measure to keep Coloradans housed by establishing some clear and reasonable reasons for when a landlord is able to evict a tenant. This is particularly important when it comes time to renew the lease. Often landlords, if they want to charge more money, can kick a tenant out and then rent that unit for a much higher cost. So this helps stem discrimination, protects folks from displacement, helps mitigate evictions, and hopefully homelessness in our state. We again pushed for small amendments to ensure that there wouldn't be additional barriers created for entities like CCH providing time-limited housing outside of that traditional landlord-tenant relationship. I'll also speak a little bit to some bills that directly address homelessness. Of course, all of the bills that we work on every legislative session have a relationship to homelessness, but these do address it specifically. And all of them were ones that we supported, and all of them passed, fortunately. The first bill is Senate Bill 16, which addresses some concerns related to the homelessness contribution tax credit, which was created in 2022 through House Bill 1083. We were a lead organization in establishing that tax credit in its current form. But what this bill does is clarifies that intermediaries can collect those donations and then give them to providers of homelessness services. And it also makes sure that donors don't have to provide their entire Social Security number to donate under this program. So it just makes the program more efficient, works better both for donors and for recipient organizations. Next is House Bill 1403, which creates the Financial Assistance Program for students experiencing homelessness. And this directs the Department of Higher Education to provide some financial support to students who have experienced homelessness at any time during high school. And then finally in this bucket is Senate Bill 191, which requires the Department of Human Services to oversee the operations of the host home program for youth who've been removed from their guardian's home or maybe at risk of homelessness. It also requires programs to report some key data points to the Homeless Management Information System and the Office of Homeless Youth Services. So again, we can better understand what the issue is and how we can tackle it in the future. It is worth noting that Colorado as a state still doesn't have a statewide homelessness strategy, which is a real shame. And the coalition will continue to advocate for something that looks like a comprehensive strategy that guides the state's approach to homelessness prevention and resolution in future legislative sessions. So the last bucket that I'll talk about is around substance use disorders and harm reduction. This year, the coalition engaged deeply on drug policy as a member of the newly formalized Right Response Colorado Coalition. Previously, this coalition had met in response to a really bad bill that addressed fentanyl use, and we had called ourselves the Fentanyl Coalition for a couple of years, but we decided it was time for something that was a little bit more formal. And so we worked with orgs like Mental Health Colorado, Healthier Colorado, ACLU, and the Harm Reduction Action Center on several bills this year. The first four bills I'll talk about all came out of the Opioid and Other Substance Use Disorder Study Committee, which meets between legislative sessions and makes recommendations for policies. They met 6 times over the interim to tackle 4 big issues: prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and recovery. And that's what these bills address. And they all had bipartisan support and they all passed. The first is Senate Bill 47. This dedicates resources to the prevention of substance use disorders through screening, planning, guidance, and data collection. The next is House Bill 1037, which focuses on implementation of proven harm reduction measures. Among other provisions, it provides protection for people in possession of drug paraphernalia from syringe exchange programs. It reduces warrant checking in hospital settings for people who use drugs, and further clarifies protections for the distribution of opioid antagonists such as naloxone. And CCH's own Dana Constanzer, psychiatric nurse practitioner, testified to all of these great points in support of the bill. Next is House Bill 1045, and we also had support from CCH staff on this bill. It does a lot of things related to treatment for substance use disorders, but we focused specifically on advocacy on one piece, which removes the prescribing cap for buprenorphine and other medications used for medication-assisted treatment under all Colorado insurance plans, including Medicaid, which is really fantastic. Joanna Leonard, our Director of Pharmacy Services, testified in support of this bill, citing some really compelling research that higher doses of buprenorphine are needed in this environment, especially considering the prevalence of fentanyl. Finally is Senate Bill 48, which focuses on recovery from substance use disorders, including designating recovery residents, sober living facilities, and sober homes as residential for the purposes of zoning. So making it much easier for those types of facilities to get established and operate, and also limiting alcohol advertisements in grocery stores. We engaged on a few other bills in this issue area. Unfortunately, a couple of those did not pass, and a couple of those were bad bills. First is House Bill 1028, and what this bill would have done had it passed is established a standard where local governments can create and operate an overdose prevention center within their boundaries. And these centers are used as a resource for folks who use drugs so that they can prevent fatal overdose. We got rumblings from the governor's office and from specific legislators on key committees that they would not be supporting this year. So this ended up being a little bit more of a messaging bill, but it is something that we will absolutely continue to fight for in the future. Next bill that failed was Senate Bill 181. This would have created the Alcohol Impact and Recovery Enterprise. The enterprise would have collected a modest fee from Colorado alcohol manufacturers and wholesalers and used that fee for alcohol-related substance use disorder prevention, intervention, treatment, harm reduction, and recovery. CCH's Dr. Ed Farrell has been a really vocal advocate on this topic for a long time, but unfortunately, the industry voices were louder and this didn't make it. We also took a strong stand against 2 harmful bills. The first bill, Senate Bill 1126, would have allowed courts to mandate substance use treatment as a condition of bond if they believe that substance use contributed to an underlying crime like camping or lying on the sidewalk or petty theft or virtually any other low-level crime of poverty. They can mandate treatment. This is problematic for a number of reasons. First, this really targets people experiencing homelessness and living in poverty. And this also mandates treatment in an environment where there is far from enough treatment available for those who want it. And even that treatment that's available is not affordable to many people. So this is a bad bill. We pushed back hard and it was killed in its first committee. Similarly, House Bill 1306 would have made possession of any amount of fentanyl a felony, regardless of whether a person who is in possession of that drug knows that it has fentanyl in it. Oftentimes, someone thinks that they are buying or consuming a Xanax and there's fentanyl in it. So this is a really, really problematic bill. We know that criminalizing individuals who use drugs is ineffective and counterintuitive and harmful policy. So we testified in opposition, and again, this bill died in its first committee. So looking forward, we'll continue to push back on harmful policies and advocate for ones that dedicate resources and invest in policies and practices that we know work, alongside our partners at RRC. And with that, I will send it back to Andrew to talk about some of our other policy priorities this year.
Thanks, Aubrey. Thanks for diving in and getting us that great overview of all these bills that we've been working on. Next here, we'll talk about public health and healthcare funding. There are a few bills that we worked on: House Bill 241002, Senate Bill 2418, and Senate Bill 2410, that provide for the mutual recognition of licenses from other states for social workers, dentists and dental hygienists, and physician's assistants. These bills all passed and will help facilitate interstate practice and hopefully allow more qualified professionals who want to come to Colorado to work and offer these important healthcare services to do so. Like I said, these bills all passed with pretty robust bipartisan support, and the social worker compact will become effective once it is ratified in seven member states. The other two will become effective on July 31st, 2024, as they have already been ratified by enough member states for the bills to go into law. Not mentioned here, but something that I definitely want to include is that during the legislative process every year, both at the state house during the legislative session and at the federal level, one of the things that we advocate for is funding for federally qualified health centers, like the one that we provide at the Stout Street Health Center at the Coalition. We advocate for funding to these programs, and unfortunately this year there were a lot of line items that were cut during the budget process. And the primary care fund, which provides crucial funding for these federally qualified health centers, unfortunately was cut from 7 million to 6.5 million. Although we weren't happy to see the cut, it is a relatively modest cut compared to other items that were really drastically cut or eliminated entirely. This is only one-time funding for the fiscal year 2024-2025. So we will have to keep advocating for hopefully increases to these funds and fight back cuts, but we were able to fight off a larger cut. And we did that through the work with our partners, the Colorado Community Health Network, which we are a member of for the ongoing advocacy. And they've been a great partner in making this push with us. The next group of bills, next slide here, please. Thank you. Next group that I will talk about is bills related to economic justice. So this is a pretty wide range and can encompass a lot of different things. Some of these things are related to programs that would provide cash for families. A lot of the tax credit bills we include in this economic justice bill bucket. But the first bill is Senate Bill 24-11, adjustments to the Colorado Necessary Document Program. This was one of our priority bills at our CCH Lobby Day and was the result of almost a whole year of research and stakeholding with a wide group of partners and stakeholders throughout the state. We also worked on this bill with a core group of the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, Homeward Alliance, and Violence Free Colorado, who were really crucial in all the efforts on this bill. But what this bill would have done is make adjustments to the Colorado Necessary Documents Program, which was established in 2016 and provides for vouchers for free identification documents to certain key populations. So this includes residents who are victims of domestic violence, impacted by a natural disaster, low income, disabled, experiencing homelessness, or elderly. And it provides for documentations of identity, status, or citizenship. So think of a driver's license, ID card, birth certificate, or any documents required to obtain those documents. Unfortunately, we know that the cost to obtain these documents can be really prohibitive for some people. And without them, obviously you need documents like this to do really everything in our society, but people can't open a bank account, you can't access healthcare, you can struggle to access housing, employment, public benefits, you name it. So this program provides for free vouchers to people within the key populations. And what we sought to adjust was both, one, the funding. We know that this program, while very effective, is drastically underfunded. Although we had some support from members of the Joint Budget Committee, we unfortunately weren't able to make the funding ask this year due to such a tight budget environment, but that's something that will definitely return to get in future years. This year, we sought a more administrative change and reducing the need for that physical voucher. So we wanted instead for people who participate in the program, instead of having to get connected to a nonprofit like CCH and get one of these physical vouchers, we sought for them to go directly to the DMV and be able to self-attest to their status and say, yes, I'm eligible for this program, and be able to access a document directly at the point of service. So unfortunately, we had a pretty late bill introduction and some last minute opposition testimony that we weren't expecting, which derailed a bit of the efforts on this bill, but this is something that we're definitely going to be returning to work on in future years. Next bill related to tax credits is House Bill 24-1311. This was led by our partners at the Colorado Fiscal Institute, as well as the Colorado Children's Campaign and Gary Community Ventures. And this bill builds on our state child tax credit, which we know has been very effective, and creates a refundable tax credit of up to $3,200 for families that are making up to $95,000 annually. One of the really special things about this credit is that it also extends the credit to families with kids under 17. So usually families with a bit older children, but people who nonetheless need support taking care of these children are now able to access the credit. And we're really excited because we believe this bill has the potential to greatly reduce child poverty. I think there have been a lot of studies and estimates that this bill could even cut child poverty in half in Colorado, and is a really effective and efficient use of state revenue to provide a really helpful boost to working families. We especially were supportive of this bill because we know that family homelessness increased in Colorado by approximately 69% between 2022 and 2023. This was actually the largest increase of any state in the country, and we appreciate efforts like this that will hopefully reduce that impact and lead more families to gain stability. Next bill, also related to tax credits, is House Bill 24-1134. Adjustments to tax expenditures to reduce burden, which expands the state earned income tax credit, also known as the EITC, to 50% of the federal credit. So the state provides a match for that federal credit, and in the 2024 tax year, that will be 50% of the federal credit. In years going forward, 2025 will be 35% of that federal credit, and then 25% for the 2026 tax year. This is something that we've been able to do temporarily in Colorado, but we're really excited to have legislation to make this a more permanent change and make sure that we are providing a match of that federal credit. It also makes some technical changes and merges the child independent care tax credit with the low income child care expenses tax credit to create the child independent care tax credit, also known as the CDCTC. I know that's a lot of different words. Essentially, it combines two credits that were previously had pretty low uptake into one. So it seeks to streamline that and hopefully increase uptake of this really important credit. And that one funds taxpayers who are making up to $60,000 annually for childcare expenses. The last bill in this economic justice bucket, unfortunately, also did not pass, but that was Senate Bill 2412, Reentry Workforce Development Cash Assistance Pilot Program. And this bill would have created a pilot program in the Department of Corrections to provide direct cash assistance to people who participate in workforce services or training programs right after their incarceration. The bill would have provided up to $3,000 for eligible individuals, but unfortunately, because of the really large fiscal note, they had a huge price tag, and that was the main reason that the bill failed this year. So we will continue to support efforts like this that provide direct cash assistance and get it right into the hands of people who are most in need. We also appreciate the incentives to work and get people cash while they work to get back on their feet after incarceration. So next slide here. Criminal legal reform, there were two bills that we worked on. Obviously, a lot of bills that we've touched on. Aubrey mentioned a few in the substance use bucket, but those touch on criminal legal reform as well. And we do a lot of work at the intersection of criminal legal reform and behavioral health through that Right Response Colorado Coalition. But there are a couple more that I'll mention. House Bill 24-1133 builds on some efforts back in 2022 to improve automatic record sealing for nonviolent crimes. The bill clarifies eligibility and streamlines the record sealing process. Under current law, when a person is arrested in the case of mistaken identity, they are required to petition the court for an expungement order, and that must be done through the arresting agency. And so what House Bill 241133 does is allow the defendant in that case to petition for the expungement order, even if the arresting agency doesn't do so, and make sure that there are no associated costs with doing that. And that bill passed with strong bipartisan support and was led by our friends over at Healthier Colorado. The next one, House Bill 241241, alignment of petty property crime threshold, sought to align state and municipal court petty theft thresholds for the purpose of setting pretrial bond. And this was led by our partners at the Colorado Freedom Fund. And essentially what it does is closes a loophole where individuals who are arrested for really low level charges in municipal court can be jailed on cash bond pretrial. However, if this happens in the state court, they can't be held in jail. So this eliminates that loophole and really seeks to clarify the rules throughout the state and different courts. And we're supportive of this because we know that a lot of the people who are impacted are unfortunately people who are experiencing homelessness, as petty theft is really driven by poverty. And last bucket of bills here. Thank you to everyone for hanging with us here. I know this is a lot of content to share all at once. And the miscellaneous bucket is bills that don't really neatly fit into any of our categories, but bills that we were involved with nonetheless. Three of the biggest ones were House Bill 241130, privacy of biometric identifiers and data, which was led by our partners at the ACLU Colorado. And it amends the Colorado Privacy Act to add protections for individuals' biometric data and establishes some really clear standards for disclosure, consent, how data is collected, shared, and stored. We know that biometric identifiers are being used really everywhere, but especially in public housing and affordable housing, as well as to gain access to shelters and really other essential services. And while there are some benefits to incorporating this, we also know that it'll disproportionately target people who are experiencing homelessness, who are also most at risk of abuses of these kind of data, frankly. And we're really glad to see this bill passed. We testified, I believe, in both chambers, and excited to see some reasonable guardrails implemented on how data is used and collected. Next bill, Senate Bill 2472, voting for confined eligible electors. This is one that we were really excited to partner with or a lot of our partners on. This was led by our partners at the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, and it creates access to voting and voter registration programs for confined voters in Colorado's 61 county jails. We do a lot of voter registration efforts at the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, and we will do so in 2024. One thing that I often hear from people that we engage in voter registration is that they didn't know that they could vote with a criminal record. Fortunately, in Colorado, people can vote as long as they're not serving a sentence of confinement for a felony at the time of the election. People, when they hear that, are often really surprised, excited to learn that they can participate in the process. So providing this kind of education and outreach to make sure people know that they can vote and giving them access to do so is really important. So we're really excited to see that this bill will connect to voters and making sure that they're aware of their right to vote and have the full freedom to exercise their right to vote. And last bill here, this bill unfortunately did not pass, but it was Senate Bill 36, Vulnerable Road User Protection Enterprise, which would have created an enterprise in the Department of Transportation to fund transportation system infrastructure that is more friendly to pedestrians. It would have imposed a small fee on personal vehicles based on size, with the largest vehicles having the largest fee. We know that larger vehicles are actually are responsible for a larger portion of traffic deaths. So that's where the fee was targeted. And we know that people who are unhoused are largely dependent on walking, biking, and other forms of public transportation to get to all the essential things that they need to get to, and unfortunately are at a disproportionate risk of collisions, traffic deaths, injuries. So this was a bill that we were excited to support, but was unfortunately killed in Senate Finance. And with that, we'll go to the next slide here. I think I can pass back to Aubrey to begin the closing.
Thanks, Andrew. So as you can tell, all of these efforts are done in partnership with other coalitions and organizations and staff and clients and community members. So we just want to send out a huge thank you to all of our partners this year. This is a huge list with tiny text, so I don't expect everyone to look through that now. But you can take a look at this list and a more detailed description of all of our work this legislative session in our legislative report, which we will send out in a recap email following this event, along with the recording and any other resources that we mentioned today. So thank you to you all for any efforts that you engaged in to help us get where we got this legislative session. And I see we've got a few minutes left, so I'll jump into Q&A if that sounds good to folks. I see one question here. Is there a typical reason that the governor would not sign a bill and just allow it to become law? So that's usually a message that he's sending, that he's not terribly supportive of the idea, but he is not going to make waves by actually vetoing it. So he'll let it become law, but doesn't want any fanfare around it necessarily. So it definitely sends a message.
And I'll also mention that there are some cases where the governor can issue a signing statement to accompany a bill as it's signed, which can have a more direct message. Um, those are usually addressed to legislators, but advocates as well, and organizations like us and all of our partners who work on these bills. And that can sometimes provide rationale for why the bill was vetoed, rationale for why it was signed, but maybe some concerns or whatever it may be.
And please remember to put your questions in the Q&A section, but I do see a question in the chat that I can answer. It asks if we can talk a little bit more about House Bill 1322 and what that might mean to homeless housing in the future. So as a refresher, this is the bill that pairs supportive services with housing, and it would direct HICPUF, the Colorado Department of Healthcare Policy and Finance, to apply for a federal waiver so that Medicaid can cover those services. We know based on years of research that that's what works to get people from homelessness into housing and on a path to stability, kind of on their own terms too, where they can identify the resources that they need and the goals that they have for themselves. So this bill is pretty broad in terms of the services that it supports. It covers housing support services like housing navigation and eviction prevention. It also supports nutrition prescriptions, so people who have medically mandated diets, for example. I don't believe it specifically mentions the elderly population, which this person mentioned in the chat, but I think that this will absolutely help with folks who are aging in Colorado and who might be at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness. We know that's a huge growing population. So we are in conversation with DOLA and with HICPUF and with other partners kind of about those details, but we want to keep it broad so that we can be nimble and respond to emerging needs. And then somebody asked about legislation advocating for youth homelessness. That's a great question. There were a couple bills that addressed youth homelessness, including one that supports students who have experienced homelessness during high school, helps them financially to pay for their continued education, and then one that helps with the host home program for folks who have been removed from their homes or are at risk of homelessness. So we're happy to see those bills move forward. Has there been a study funded to know causes for high increase in homelessness in Colorado, as you noted, that occurred from 2020 to present? Yes, great question. And we know that really it's the housing market that is the biggest driver of those increases in homelessness. That has been indicated through local, state, and national studies. So as vacancy rates decline and as rent costs increase and as evictions increase, homelessness increases. And we are seeing a huge increase also in first-time homelessness, so folks who'd never experienced homelessness before, and in family homelessness, so folks with kids. And I think this is all very related to housing market factors.
Yeah, and I would definitely recommend for folks who are looking to learn more about homelessness in general, checking out some of our Ed Series presentations. We do a great Homelessness 101 that covers a lot of the causes and things that we can do to address homelessness more broadly. And we'd be happy to share that out afterwards with some more information.
Absolutely. So, Andrew, why don't we make some predictions for the next legislative session? I think it's going to be kind of hard to say because there's going to be a big state election and federal election between now and the next session. So the makeup of the General Assembly could potentially change dramatically. I don't know that it will, but it's a possibility. So I think there are certainly some policy areas that we'll work on in the future, including, I think single family zoning might be something that comes up. That was part of the land use bill, and that's not something that we tackled this year in a separate bill. I think working on overdose prevention centers, allowing local governments to establish those will be something we address again. The necessary documents bill will be something we tackle again. Anything else that you can think of, Andrew? Any predictions?
No, I agree that it's hard to say, and I would stress to everyone on the call the importance of voting. When we talk about bills that died in committee, oftentimes that is one vote, and that might be your district, your senator, or your representative, who is that determining vote. So I would encourage everyone to make sure you vote, make sure your voices are heard, and encourage your friends and family to do the same. But I think it is hard to look into that crystal ball and predict a few things. I know that we have some failed efforts from this year that will certainly be coming back to get the win on, and fighting a lot of the same fights that we usually fight, making sure that we dedicate funding to programs that we know work, like Housing First, and pushing back against harmful treatment first kind of programs. So,
yeah, great observations, Andrew. Hamilton asks in the Q&A, are there any conversations related to the housing crisis and limiting foreign and multinational corporations' purchases of family homes? I'm so glad you brought that up. That is something that's becoming really concerning for us in the housing advocacy space. And there was a bill that passed, I believe, in 2023, or it might have been 2022, that directs the state to do an analysis of the impact of ownership, like corporate ownership and foreign ownership of housing in Colorado, and make recommendations for policies that can address that. I believe those results are due in 2025. So I'm hopeful that maybe next year and maybe in 2026, depending on the timing, we will see some really strong policies coming out of that to curtail some of that really problematic purchase of homes by those corporations.
yeah, and that was last year. That was House Bill 23-1253, and I just dropped that in the chat if people are interested in looking more into that.
All right, I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A, so we can probably go ahead and begin to close. Thanks, Gabriella, for getting us back into the slide deck. So we want you to get involved with this work. There are always opportunities for you to help drive our policy work and get involved in advocacy and learn more about what happens under the Gold Dome. A great way to start is just by following us on social media. Again, you can find us on every platform at Coalition. You can join our advocacy committee and advocacy network and reach out to me to get connected with those resources. I'll drop my info in the chat, or somebody else can drop my email there. You can sign up for our mailing list to receive updates through the legislative session. I assume most of you are on that since you got the notification of this event. But if you're not, make sure you get on that and recommend it to your friends and your neighbors. You can also review our legislative wrap-up report. It gets into really great detail about all of these bills and more. And tips for accessing the lawmaking process. Andrew has created some really great documents that help describe opportunities to get involved. So please feel free to reach out anytime with ideas, what's making your life or your neighbor's life hard and what could make it better, because we always want to hear those things and try to incorporate that into our policy priorities. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We couldn't do it without you, and we love working in partnership with y'all. And please do join us for our July education series on the economics of homelessness. And we'll send out more information shortly.